It's very simple. It's building communities of action. And what builds those communities of action is journalism. But in the end, it's the action part that I was most interested in. And originally when we started, I was like, oh, I'm going to take video and put it in your pocket. And I was like, no, what does technology actually allow us to do? It's a direct connection to build communities. And how do you strengthen democracy? You strengthen it bottom up. From my part of the world, waiting for governments to actually strengthen institutions. I've watched the Philippines from people power in 1986 until the time when we set up Rappler in 2012. And I was like, while I had faith, the processes of governance are slow. And when you don't have institutions, you repeat the same mistakes over and over. And I had great faith that the technology would actually enable journalists working with our community to push change bottom up. A direct link to your audience. You know, and I was with CNN, I loved that I could control everything in that box. When you do television, everything there, the lighting, in that square, you control all of it. But you don't get anything back, right? So you go do your story a minute and a half and you throw it into the black box. It's like this universe and you don't know what it's like, how people are impacted by it. If you work for a Western news organization, which I did, oftentimes the reaction of your local community versus the global community go opposite directions. You know, an example is Indonesia. 9/11, the Western world looked at it a particular way, but when you're reporting from the country with the world's largest Muslim population, you see a different view. And so you have to surface both. That was part of the challenge. As a Filipino-American, there were things that I felt Western journalists made fun of in our culture. And for me, as a young reporter, it was about trying to tell the rest of the world why Filipinos were like this. And I think developing from that, learning the profession of journalism at an age where it was much simpler and you could learn the craft. The problem today is that you not only learn the craft of it, you have to have 2 brains and 6 hands to be able to do things quickly. You don't have the luxury of time to think it through because it's real time and you're intimately connected to your community. So when we started Rappler, one of the first things I thought that was so funny was we would do a nightly newscast, right? And we started it like traditional TV. It was a 30-minute newscast. And then over time, it's now like 30 seconds for it's now far shorter. But in that time period, when we were treating it like it was television, I was laughing because our audience would say, hey, where are you? We're waiting. And I was tweeting back. That's kind of cool. That was really cool and annoying, but it's so interesting when you put that kind of interactivity, the ability to talk directly to your community, when you put it towards climate change issues. The Philippines is the 3rd most disaster-prone nation in the world. We get an average of 20 typhoons every year. And in 2013, we began working with our community and the government to come up with a set of hashtags that we've standardized. And then we built a platform where the government can see on the map who needs help, who needs rescue, who has information. It's real time, it's transparent to everyone. And then the Office of Civil Defense will then give whoever needs help to the cluster group that can act on it. That to me is still the most, that's the closest to what I feel like we can do, because we did help save lives during that time period. And the reason why the community comes here is not just because of the platform, which is transparent to everyone, but also because they get information they can trust. That's 3 years before all hell broke loose, right? With Brexit, the election of Duterte, disinformation. Actually, if you go back, 2014 was really when disinformation kicked in the Ukraine. I didn't know how it could be used for evil when we started. And seeing it now, I realized that this technology, the people who built it, needed to put in the safeguards. When I talk to Facebook or Twitter or Google, they think that they're separate from reality. They think that the code is something that an engineer can think through, but in reality, it's directly connected to human behavior. And what they've done is, and I think this is where technology is the enabler of authoritarian populist governments, because they were able to use the same tools of empowerment to actually clamp down on democracy. And that's where the engineers just are going to have to get smarter, where old power, the way we used to have balance in the old world from politicians and governments, like the UN, this type of old power needs to connect with this new power that is algorithmic based. We need to, as journalists, stop looking at it as content and look at these networks of disinformation. And they need to come together. And until that happens, it's going to be chaotic. In transition, they have to mirror the power structures of the real world. And I don't understand why there is such an aversion to that. The ideal for the platforms, the social media platforms, is that they give everyone equal voice. But you know what? They're choosing who gets the voice. And by allowing, they didn't realize that they were going to be gamed. By allowing that, they're disrupting the real world power structures. So I suppose it's like building a city. So if you have Oxford University, and then you gave everyone a gun and you told them let loose, or forget the gun, let's just say a megaphone, right? And if everyone is screaming at the same time, and only an algorithm which has an inherent bias of whoever coded it, and the inherent bias of these algorithms right now is popularity. So it's not a far-fetched reach that a populist governments all over the world are coming to power, because that's what they coded in. So the one ask, reflect as a base, they're going to have to understand real-world geopolitical balance and somehow be able to reflect that in how they show the news. Okay, so I think this is the biggest change that has happened, is that we used to be the gatekeepers. Journalists were trained. We walked into journalists in news organizations knowing that we were going to make decisions about who was right and who was wrong, who gets the megaphone and who doesn't, right? We made those calls and we were imbued with a sense of mission. All of a sudden, the social media platforms have been given that power. And I think that began in 2015, when they took all the news groups into instant articles. But they didn't realize that when they did that they would become the world's largest distributor of news. And the minute they did that, without the safeguards that we put in, the journalists put in, then it became, I think that's what turned the powers balance off, that shifted the power balance off. And you can see it in the studies, and it began as early as, the first one was freedomhouse.org in November of 2017. They said in 30 of 65 countries globally, cheap armies on social media rolled back democracy. That was followed by The Economist a few months later, and then by the Reporters Sans Frontiers. So those tech companies, American tech companies, American idealists, they have to come out of their ivory towers and realize that their algorithms unleashed in the global south are killing people. And when I heard Mark Zuckerberg in Congress say it may take us 5 years, all I thought was, I don't have 5 years. We don't have 5 years. So action, I hope quickly. No, absolutely not. I couldn't. So this is why I have a love-hate relationship. I don't think our world can go back to a time before social media. I think social media is fantastic to challenge entrenched power structures, right? And there's always a grain of truth in the 99% who are demanding more from the 1% with power. But what we saw was just ignorance and arrogance in 2016, and it rippled through our worlds. And quick action. We know how smart and how fast the platforms work. And I think that because they're faced with this, with what they had unleashed, you know, Facebook said, what was one of the things? They said that we move fast, we break things. Okay, so you broke democracy, fix it. Just fix it, right? You're never going to get it right. Unfortunately, we can't stay where we are right now. And I think that there is good faith effort. So this is where today we're working closely with Facebook, with Twitter, with Google. I think our world now is tech-driven. I think the future of journalism is in data and tech. And we need to be able to work closely and understand how data and tech will change our world. The way we do data journalism is still too much content-driven. We have to, these are all things I grapple with all the time. Anyway, sorry, it's just like 4 thoughts came in at the same time, right? I think there's a simple understanding we have, which is that the big change in technology was actually the ability to get big data and to work with big data. It is information technology, right? I mean, World Economic Forum said this, it's the 4th revolution, but what does that mean? So once all these big data sets came in, it accelerated everything. It's that exponential growth of the amount of information, how it was harnessed by individual companies initially, like you're talking about Airbnb, you know, companies that are able to leverage information, get it to the right people at the right time, and they're able to grow companies and actually the path. Before this kind of information revolution, it took a company 20 years to get a market cap of $1 billion. That's a normal thing, right? And then when you had Facebooks and all of these Airbnb, Uber, all of a sudden that came down to less than 2 years. So that's the first danger signal. We were all I was celebrating it. And all of a sudden I realized, well, all of that also goes down to the individual capacity to absorb information. And when it crippled democracy, it came down to a tactic that was, I think originally came from Russian disinformation, right? A tactic to flood you with so much information that you have no idea what is fact or fiction. And that was enabled by the algorithms of the social media platforms. How did but I'm sorry, I was wrapping my head again around all of this. How did we deal with the technology? The first was to embrace social network theory. If you say that social networks are family and friends, right, in the real world, social media are our family and friends on steroids. And that is the basic thing. So that's how Rappler, in the first year, we embraced social media. We knew that, you know, if I can meet you in the real world and then we can both be on social media simultaneously, that we will increase ×4. We will increase our capacity to reach more people. And if we can build it, it's exponential. There's an old shampoo commercial in the United States of Fabergé Organics, and they told 2 friends, and so on, and so on, and so on. Do you know this commercial? If you're in America, you know. So it was that exponential growth. We felt it in Rappler, and then beyond that, I started looking at social networks because of the way the ideology of terrorism spreads. That was my first book. My second book is called From Bin Laden to Facebook, and it was how it moved exponentially. And I wrote the book a year before ISIS really perfected this exponential spread of this radical ideology. And I thought, if the terrorists can use it for evil, then why can we not, journalists, not use it for good? So that was the basic idea, that we can harness and build communities of action. Yeah, sounds so idealistic in this context now, right? But I think it's still there. I think that's what we should be doing. And I actually, after today, one of the things that I realized is journalists should be coming together, right? We should be. I mean, this is one of the things we're starting to do in the Philippines. We're combining resources, we're combining knowledge, and then we're expanding our reach because we're coming together. You go back to the mission of what journalism is. And don't forget, it's not just us collaborating with each other, it's also collaborating with our communities. And actually, that might be really fun. That's the one part. We didn't really talk about that today, right? Because in the end, journalism now is truly in that period of creative destruction, because we're being destroyed. But we're also surviving it in different ways. And how do we get through there? We're going to have to find a new business model because the old one is destroyed. It's dead. We're going to have to find a way to regain trust because we've been crippled. In countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, journalists, news groups had the highest credibility. For years, that's what all the surveys showed, precisely because our institutions were so weak. Now, we've been targeted and we're seeing that shift, right? So in my country, in the Philippines, we're fighting it. I still think that we can win this. And I think our communities will come through in the end. Fear only does so much, and at a certain point, the kind of anger and this is the tactic, use anger, pound the fracture lines of society, and then create a spiral of silence so that people don't jump in when there is something that is clearly wrong. Well, there are ends. Like the spiral of silence in the Philippines for the drug war lasted about a year. A year. It's a painful year, but it's over. And slowly people are finding their voices. So I think living through it is painful, but I think it's that kind of creative destruction. The community will come out of it knowing more, learning more. And I hope that this next generation is more self-aware and will be able to work in constructive ways with journalists. Then the next step that we have to do as journalists is to understand, one, to have the humility. We no longer will determine. We can't do this alone. And I think that's really hard to take. I still long for the old days every now and then. But, if we can embrace that, that might be where the future is. So we're experimenting. That's what we're trying to do in Rappler. And I think one of the things I showed is that our community is helping pay our legal fees. That's kind of cool. I think it's not that I like it. It's that it is the way it is. So I think for me, the word is impact, right? How are you going to use the technology today to have impact in your community? And again, I think the difference between someone like me who lives in a country where institutions are weak and someone who lives in the United States or in Europe, right? Well, not all of you, who lives in countries where institutions are strong. For me, it was always about trying to help strengthen democracy. And now, apparently, both the West and our countries have to come together to help strengthen democracy. How are you going to do that? You can't do it from an ivory tower. You have to harness your community. Like I said, I long for the old days. Boy, I really loved it when your word, whatever your analysis was, is it. But that's not where we live anymore. We can't turn back the clock. We want to have impact. I think that's the other thing. There's a missionary zeal. That's the reason why you become a journalist. You want to build a better world. We don't do it through politics. We do it through analytical stories. And here's the last part we didn't talk about. Thinking fast, thinking slow, right? This goes down to the human beings who are reading or watching the stories that you do. And human beings today have been manipulated and are now amped up on the adrenaline, the dopamine of social media. Anger spreads fastest. It is emotionally driven. So here you come with a story. Here's your data journalism story. And it's got all these figures. It's not going to make a dent. So we have to find this balance between doing what we do best, which is telling good stories, adding the data, and then embracing the technology. Because in the end, no journalist wants to be in an empty church. Our goal is to make our societies better, to make our democracy stronger. And I believe that the technology will allow us to do that. We just have to get through this creative destruction. Thank you.